Muchas gracias por su asistencia. Hoy tenemos con nosotros a Tobias Wieland, quien nos va a presentar una muy interesante conferencia sobre las posibilidades de una teoría crítica del erotismo. La conferencia va a ser en inglés, pero va a haber oportunidad de hacer preguntas y de responder eventualmente a estas en inglés y también en castellano. ¿Bien? Entonces, que disfruten la conferencia. El profesor Wieland nos acompaña desde Berlín y es un gran placer y un honor tenerlo con nosotros. Gracias.
Bueno, muchísimas gracias Gianfranco por invitarme y por darme la posibilidad de presentar unas, lo voy a llamar una conceptual exploration, ¿ya? Así como una exploración conceptual a un tema que es un tema que me llama mucho la atención a nivel personal, pero también a nivel académico. Es la cuestión del eroticismo, es la cuestión de la emancipación pensativa de una manera corporal, ¿no? This is my general topic. Let me briefly, before I start with my actual presentation and following my slides, about myself in terms of what drives my interest when it comes to these personal and somewhat intimate topics. I've done my PhD on the relevance and actuality of Hegel for a critical theory. That is my so-called first book, and I will continue working on that. But within this academic field and the game that we are playing, there is this, what they call the second book. So you need to come up with a second topic that is rather independent from the first topic to flesh out your academic profile. And this is what I'm going to present now, is actually the first ideas of that second book. So the second book is, the subtitle of that book will be A Critical Theory of Eroticism. So that's kind of, it's new. It's a topic that I've been working on since a couple of years, but it's still fresh. And so I'm very happy to discuss my first ideas. And I'm timed for about half an hour of a presentation. And then this shall give us a lot of time for questions of understanding, feedback, and I would really love to hear what you have to say about these matters, because, like I said, for me it's a fresh topic, so to speak. Okay, I think in critical theory in general, the quest for emancipation, that's to say the overcoming of structural power relations, I think this is beyond any doubt, has always been at the forefront of critical theory. But I think it's surprisingly that, to my understanding, it has been only Marcuse, one of the first generation theorists of critical theory, who has put up a book on that very question of sexual emancipation. There is a book called Eros and Civilization, and this is so far the only prominent book that directly addresses the bodily, and that's to say the erotic dimension of emancipation in critical theory. I do find this surprising because what Marcuse does is actually he engages rather directly with the psychoanalytical framework provided by Freud. Yeah? In direct exchange with Freud, Marcuse analyzes under the Freudian title of the Realitätsprinzip, reality principle, what Marcuse understands as a sexually suppressed society. That is the society of Western modernity. And here comes a little quote. I have to contextualize that quote first. In the first part, there is this scrutiny of the suppressed society. In the second part, under the title of a new reality principle, or a lust principle, pleasure principle, he offers an utopian alternative to what he calls the repressed society. So and that quote comes from the second part. So here it is kind of an outline of a non-repressive order, and that is, according to Marcuse, possible only if the sex instinct can, and that is to say, can by virtue of the dynamic and only under changed existential and societal conditions, and that's to say, sex become to generate lasting erotic relations among mature individuals. So this is the idea, lasting erotic relations under a non-repressed societal order. And the idea that Marcuse puts forward in order to reach to this utopian idea is that we have to, and he comes back to Schiller actually, that we have to turn labor into play, and then we can develop something Makule has as the libidinal rationality. There is a sort of a rationality that is bodily, that is aesthetical, that is what we might call the erotic. And this entire framework of, let's say, a critical theory of eroticism in exchange with psychoanalysis, as interesting as it is in 1963, to my understanding, has been left aside in critical theory. Yeah? To my understanding, there is no one prominent enough in that field to engage us in this line of thinking. Yeah? There is little to be said on this. I mean, there is, if we have a look on Honnet, also Rahel Jägi, up to a certain extent, also with Habermas in the German-speaking tradition, what we do have is a theoretical engagement with the role of intimacy. That's true. But when they speak of intimacy, what they often mean is actually the engagement with marriage. So it's either the emancipation within marriage or even from marriage. Yeah? But sex, and that very specific form of bodily exchange, is not a substantial topic in critical theory. Yeah? It has been left aside. And I find this surprising because, I mean, up to a certain extent, to me it's an obvious connection that the understanding of repression also is spelled out through sexual repression. And we can think of sexual emancipation also as a means to reach for political emancipation. But this nexus was kind of given away from the mainstream line of thinking in critical theory. I do find this surprising. Honestly, that's not the very last word on that topic, the nexus between critical theory and sex, because what we do have is the continuation of the overlap of critical theory and psychoanalysis. I mean, prominent figures here are Julia Kristeva, Lacan, Melanie Klein, Jean Laplanche, Judith Butler, Jessica Benjamin, and nowadays, well, I mean, they are contemporaneous too, but there is Catherine Malabou, Amy Allen, and someone I recently came to discover, it's a recommendation to read, Afki Sakadopoulou. These are theorists in psychoanalysis, and they often talk about desire. So that topic of sex does play a big role in the discourse, but it has been, let's say, it has not been taken up, so to speak, from the critical theory side. Yeah? It is the theory making within psychoanalysis, and I think this is an interesting reservoir for a critical theory. In that sense, I'm d'accord with Amy Allen. Amy Allen has recently published a book a couple of years ago. I think it's called The Critique on the Couch or something, in which she basically makes this case. We need to use the resources of psychoanalysis in order to come up with a critical theory of our modern conditions of living. So in that sense, I'm totally with Amy Allen. And the systematic question in this overlap between critical theory and psychoanalysis, I mean, among the many central questions, I think what we can take from there is the question of, can desire and recognition, can these two aspects, can they be reconciled? Can we combine desire as want and the quest for respect and recognition? And this is something I will continue working on in the following talk. But I will stress that the psychoanalytical tradition, often by referencing and going back to Hegel, they stress the negativity, and that's to say the ambivalence of sex. And this is different in the liberal tradition that I'm going to reconstruct now. Because having said this, that there is that the question of, or the quest of erotic emancipation has been put inside in critical theory, now I'm going to turn our attention to a different discourse, and which is not critical theory in this narrow sense. That's to say, the question of liberal feminism, because in that tradition we do find an engagement of the questions regarding sex. And in the end of my talk, I will try to combine this, let's say, tradition of liberal feminism with the idea of a critical theory of eroticism. And that's to say, we have to combine the aspect of negativity and ambivalence of sex when it comes to basically the question of consent. So the idea of consent is actually what that feminism that I'm going to construct now has come up with. So this is the overarching architecture of my talk. So from now I'm going to turn our attention to, I put this as where else to look for, because in critical theory we don't find that much. But what do we find is something that is, I think it's a recent movement in, we might say, analytical or liberal feminism, that is to say, a sex-positive feminism. So that is the question I will deal with now. What is sex-positive feminism? So I think Gail Rubin, a very prominent figure in these movements of sex-positive feminism, puts out the very premise of such a thing as sex-positive feminism. That's to say, sex is always political. Yeah, I think this is a starting point for any understanding of the, let's say the morals or the ethical framework of sex to be permissible. They all start with this idea that sex is both. It's on the same, it's something very private, something very intimate. That's to say, it's seemingly pre-political, but the preconditions of sexual freedom, they are political. And so it's not a natural thing. It's nothing we just do because nature has us to do so. It is, in fact, always loaded with meaning. And that quote, sex is always political, now is taken from an essay that Gail Rubin published in 1993. But the actual talk she gave, upon which that essay is based upon, has been given about 10 years earlier. That's to say, in a very famous conference, which is often abbreviated as the so-called Bernard College Conference, which is taken to be the first conference in the 1980s, 1982, that was explicitly addressing questions of sex-positive research. Oh, there was a sex missing in here, I'm sorry. So the first conference addressed questions of sex-positive research. Yeah, this is, there was a word missing, which is quite important, I'm sorry. So that so-called Bernard College conference was highly controversial, and there was a strong motion against it by an association called Women Against Porn. So these women, they came to actually block and intervene, and kind of, they wanted to undermine that the very discourse on sex positivity, because to them the question on porn, and I will stay with the question of porn, I will say more about that in a couple of seconds, and also the questions of BDSM, that's to say perversion, they were, for their understanding, stated too upfront on that conference. They were too positive and affirmative towards these questions or these topics. So there was a strong heat and a debate about that thing, about that very question. So the question of sex positivity has always been, from the very beginning, a super controversial topic among feminists, but also beyond. Yeah. Some people in the discourse, they refer to these debates of the early 80s as what they call the so-called sex wars. They used that term of wars, like as if a battleground. I kind of find it a bit too extreme. It was a debate. There was a strong debate going on, and it's a bit of an exaggeration to call that a war, because it's often a kind of a prejudice, often a bit of a, it's very it's not necessary to call it a war. Yeah, I think it's enough to state this as a highly heated debate. You find two references here of contemporaneous, of people who have been attending to that very conference, which I can recommend to give a bit of a broader picture of the atmosphere of the early 80s. I will not go into the atmosphere, but will try to reconstruct the systematic framework within which, or the systematic horizon within which these debates took place. In the early 80s, or stemming from the 70s, we find in the US, Western US tradition of feminism, three major strands. We find three major kind of lines of thinking. The most prominent one is the liberal one. Then we've got what is called radical feminists, and back in the days we had what they called a socialist feminism. Yeah, and I will spell that out in a couple of minutes. But before I do so, let me briefly remark on the European context. I think in Germany, the post-68 leftish feminism is kind of analogous. I think we do have exactly these kinds of strands too. The situation in France is slightly different because we do have this very strong influence there coming from the psychoanalytic tradition and also from the tradition of structuralism and post-structuralism. That's a bit of a different discourse. But I think for the US context, these three types of feminism, so to speak, they are to be in mind when it comes to the question of why the question of sex was so controversial. So to briefly characterize liberal feminism, I think it's a good starting point to come back to the question of the equality of rights here. So that is, the liberalism of liberal feminism is basically that, to ask and demand for liberal rights. And that's to say, the stress here is on the misrepresentation of women in professional and professional and political sphere. So, and the other big topic, still up to date, still current, ongoing debate, is the questions regarding the equal distribution of care work. So that's, it's a very brief characterization of liberal feminism. There's much more to be said on this, but I think this is, for the sake of my talk, enough to characterize it, because radical feminism is different in the sense that it calls for a radical reordering of society, that's to say, a society in which male supremacy is eliminated in all societal and economical contexts. So it's not about equality, it's actually about overcoming male supremacy and kind of turning things upside down. Yeah? In that sense, radical feminism is more radical than the liberals. They don't ask for liberal rights, they ask for actually kind of female supremacy up to a certain extent. So there was a quote by a book that I can highly recommend. It's a very fascinating book. It's called The Dialectic of Sex by Shulamit Firestone. And it's an interesting book. Could be a talk on its own, actually. But the quote here is that the end goal of feminist revolution, according to radical feminism, must be unlike that of the first, or we might say liberal feminist movement, not just the elimination of male privilege, but of the sex distinction itself. The genital difference between human beings would no longer matter culturally. Yeah? That is the radicality of that sort of feminism. Last but not least, I like to draw or bring into the picture what has been called the socialist tradition in feminism, and this is also kind of in opposition to the first two, which is to say that against liberal feminism, socialists hold that instead of granting equal rights for man and woman within the capitalist system, the idea should be that we shall overthrow the system itself. And that's to say, the capitalism is at the core, and that's to say, it's the actual problem. And gender equality is more of an effect of capitalism. So that's to say, if we don't overthrow capitalists, there won't be any peace among sexes, but against radical feminism within a socialist society, there is such a thing as peace among the sexes. So this is kind of the debate or the different strands of feminism in the early 80s. So having said this, I now want to come back to questions regarding sex. There was some, these sounds come from outside, right? Yeah. Sorry. So what I do find interesting is that when it comes to questions regarding sex, we often find three major topics in the room, and they all start with P. That's to say, we've got prostitution, perversion, and pornography. And there is some sort of a coalition among liberal, societal, and feminists against porn, especially. Yeah. So, like I said in my first slide on the Bernard conference, one of the leaflets and T-shirts and slogans I had is "Feminists against porn." So I will now come to that first P or the last P in my line here, the P of pornography, as an exemplar, as an example of the debates among feminists regarding sexuality. So according to someone as Robin Morgan, but also quite prominent figures in the debates are Andrea Dworkin and especially Catherine McKinnon. I think Catherine McKinnon is the most prominent still up to date, who is an activist, legal scholar against pornography. And the quote here is, "Pornography is the theory to which rape is the actual practice." And that's to say, I mean, McKinnon is a legal scholar, legal philosopher. That's to say that the question here is, does the right of free speech justify pornography? And they say it doesn't. Why? Because if you say pornography is something that we are entitled to do because we have the right for free speech, then this line of defense leaves out of the picture the very consequences of porn. And so that's to say, porn reproduces a standard image of heteronormative performance and strengthens, therefore, what they call rape culture. Rape culture. That's to say, the implications or the consequences of such a speech act, that's to say, putting porn at display, yeah, kind of provides the cultural background for the actual objectification of women. And therefore, that right of the free speech is not what justifies porn. Therefore, porn should be prohibited. Yeah? Speech act theory often plays a big role in these debates. They often analyze porn as a speech act, which is not justified because of its consequences. So that is the anti-porn position. So do find still up today lots of activists saying we should actually ban and prohibit porn. What I take now to be a sex-positive counter-argument, yeah, is to say pornography as such is not the problem. Yeah? We shall not prohibit porn. Why should we not do so? Because sex-positive argumentation often stresses the problem of the gatekeeper. So if we prohibit porn, who shall be the authority to enforce that prohibition? Now that's the problem of the gatekeeper. So let me put this out by fleshing it out a bit more in greater detail by coming back or by showing you something. And that's the problem of the gatekeeper. In 2014, I mean, that's recent, right? That's 10 years ago. The British government, a gatekeeper, passed a law that is a law that was meant to ban sex act in British porn production. Let me just read out what, according to the actual British law, is banned in British porn production. That's to say, no spanking, no canning, you know, no aggressive whipping. I mean, gentle whipping is fine, but okay. Penetration with any object associated with violence. Physical or verbal abuse. Urolacnia, I mean, golden showers, water sports. Physical restraint, role-playing as adults, humiliation, female ejaculation, strangulation, face-sitting, and fisting. So we might ask, okay, what is this for some sort of an incoherent list of sex act? And at the first glance, it might seem to be rather odd to put all these things together. But if we have a look at it, I think what we see here is that especially exclude acts of female domination. Yeah? Especially those acts who put things upside down, like female ejaculation, face-sitting, and all these things that are meant to turn the heteronormative order upside down, they're banned. They're not welcome. They're beyond the thing. And then we've got the other problem. We've got lots of terms which are hard to be defined. I mean, what does aggressive whipping mean? Yeah? I mean, if they're gentle whipping, but what is gentle whipping? This is all up to arbitrariness. So the problem of the gatekeeper is exactly that we cannot actually ban the problem because we would put the gatekeeper in a position to actually reproduce the problem, because often those who are sitting in these committees are the people from the church, the people of, we've got not the one who actually engage in sex positivity. We've got people who reproduce their own prejudices. So I don't think that prohibition will solve the problem, yeah? Because what we do find here is that kind of the classical porn script of stripping, sucking, fucking, that is left intact. That's still okay. Yeah? But everything that is beyond the heteronormative framework, that is banned. And I think this is, I think this is enough to say we shall not ban porn, but come up with something like a feminist practice of producing porn. But that's a big topic on its own. I like to move on a bit and kind of ask what is the common ground in feminism today? I mean, I started with this kind of three-partite picture, and I think the term of intersectionality is the term that allows us to unite the different forms or the different varieties of feminism, because the idea of exclusion as factors is this what they all kind of agree to, what we all agree to, that we have to understand marginalization, violence, and exclusion by these three factors of class, race, and gender. And these dimensions, they intersect, and that's to say they mark a specific societal position in the social space or a position within the field of power relations. And this is, I think, kind of the common ground of feminism up to date. I think all the main feminism, I think, it's intersectionalist feminism up to a certain extent. So, having said this, the question that I see on the horizon, or that I see the sex positive movement dealing with, is, okay, we have this idea of a intersectionality, so we understand that power relations, they are reconstructable in this network of class, gender, and race, but there are other forms of exclusions, especially when it comes to the body. That's to say, where do we place the dimension of age? Yeah, when it comes to the reconstruction of sexual exclusion, we often find this young body to be the center of attraction. So what to do with age? Where do we place age in this map of intersectionality? The same holds for ableism and neurodiversity. Yeah? Big question is neurodiversity and consent. It's a big question. And the entire question of body shaming and body mainstreaming. So the thin, the athletic, the sportive body. That is the body that gains all sexual attention. But this is also reconstructed, or we can reconstruct that as a form of exclusion. So, how to move beyond intersectionality in feminism. And I will briefly mention two books, and this is my last remark on, let's say, the analytical tradition of feminism, and then I will come back to critical theory very briefly. Two books I like to recommend to those of you who, for those of you who this is for them, it's the first time to hear about these questions. Two books, we might call them seminal books up to date. The first one is Amir Srinivasan, The Right to Sex. It's a fascinating book. It's extremely brilliant. It's sharp. It's clear. And it's my own way of reconstructing it or capturing its essence is to say it's Srinivasan's attempt is to come up with a desire critique without moralization. That's to say, she is very reluctant and hesitant, that's to say she's very liberal to a certain extent, to interrogate and question the formation of desire. So what we desire is private. Yeah? From a moral point of view, we shall not say that's wrong desire or that's good desire. Yeah? Desire as such is something that's on our own, and we shall not try to theorize desire to the aim to be able to say that's good or bad desire. Yeah? In that sense, she's reluctant to question and interrogate formation of desire. But at the same time, and the only thing that we can do from a moral philosophy point of view is to say, the only thing we can do is we can apply the distinction of wanted, unwanted, that's to say of consensual, non-consensual sex. So there is no good or bad desire. The only thing that there is consensual or non-consensual sex. That is at the very core of a moral philosophy of sex. Yeah? That is to say, that's a desired critique without moralizing it. But at the same time, we have to deal with the political question. So that's to say, what are the preconditions under which we produce our own desire? Yeah? And so this is what she has as the economy of desire as a political question. Yeah? And she has brilliant things to say on these matters. So it's a reading recommendation. The other book I'd like to recommend is also rather recent. It is by Manon Garcia, and Garcia is, she comes from a Beauvoirian Kantian perspective and brings or puts forward the idea of conversation. Yeah? So that's to say, the idea of emancipation in sex should be understood as understanding sex as a conversation among the sexes, or among, I mean, it's not necessarily between different sexes, but we shall understand sex as a conversation. So in that sense, it comes back to the idea of equality, yeah? Equal partners in a conversation. So that's to say, she starts off with an analysis of sex and desire to be highly exploitable, gendered, and desire is a gendered emotion, which has become quite central in the constructing of the gender hierarchies. Yeah? So that's to say, heteropatriarchy is a system of discourses, practices, and symbolic relations to monitor and to suppress desire and to distribute it among the sexes. So that is the starting point. And the idea of conversation is actually exactly that conversation has the power to overcome these power hierarchies because it puts emphasis on the equality of the conversational partners. And this is, by Garcia, the idea here is to go back to Kant and use that kind of third critique and the idea of the communicability of taste as a starting point for sexual ethics that is aimed and apt for overcoming the power dimensions here. Yeah? So erotic emancipation is brought about by establishing the conversation of the sexes. It's a great book. I mean, there is much more to be said on it. It's very brief. It's just to give you an idea of what I take to be the most prominent figures in sex-positive feminism up to date. Yeah, there are many others, but these two are definitely worth reading it. So, I've got three little last slides, and then I will hopefully, I will end, and we've got lots of time for discussion because I would love to hear your feedback and your questions and your responses to this. So I started my little presentation with this remark of Marcuse to be the first and also the only representative of critical theory who deals with questions of the erotic, and I took up this notion that he has as libidinal rationality, and that's to say he stresses the aesthetical dimension of the erotic. The question that I would like to put forward now, not only for us now, but also within the framework of critical theory as an agenda for critical theory of the erotic, is based on this idea of a libidinal rationality beyond the heteronormative code of conduct. That's to say, what is possible recodifications of the codes of intimacy? How would that look like? What is that? What would be a different form of intimacy, different forms of conduct? I think aesthetically, and this will bring me back to Foucault, I think such a project shall not reproduce the prejudice that what we call kink is nothing but rooted in a psychological disorder. That's to say, kink and vanilla, yeah, this distinction is so widespread in society that I don't think we shall understand kink as something related to psychologia patosexualis. So it's not a perversion. Perversion is normal, so to speak. Yeah, we are all kinky up to a certain extent. I think this is what I think would do justice to this observation by Srinivasan, that whatever critique of desire we come up with, we shall go beyond moralizing it. And normality, yeah, the term of normal is not scientific talk. There is nothing normal when it comes to sex. We all have our individual sets of ideas we all have our traumas, vulnerabilities, we've got our desires, we've got our fantasies. Nothing is normal. Yeah? There is no normality. I think in that sense, kink is extremely widespread in society, and I think this is a good starting point for any critical theory of the erotic. But what does that mean in terms of the aesthetic? Yeah? Because according to Foucault, in his Histoire de la Sexualité, he Foucault could be understood as saying that there is no such a thing as a modern ars erotica, or that there is, in Western society, is scientia sexualis, that's to say medicine. It's a medical discourse on sexuality, but there is no idea of cultivating our sexual dimension. There is no idea of practicing, like in Taoism or in the non-Western traditions. We've got this idea of meditation, of cultivation, of taking time, of being in relation with each other and cultivate that communicative skills. All that we've got is the medical discourse. Yeah, and I think if we are to understand the emancipatory dimension of sex, I think we need to come up with such a thing as a modern ars erotica. Yeah? And I think BDSM is a very good starting point to get there. Yeah? Because it's exactly about that. It's about cultivating skills, it's about refinement, it's about becoming better in listening and giving, so to speak. It's about cultivating the dialectics of dominance and submission. So I think this is one thing I like to do in the future, to develop this idea of, that I found in Marcuse, the aesthetic dimension, by using the means of BDSM. Secondly, and that brings me back to the question of how to relate critical theory and psychoanalysis. Like I said, desire has always been central. It starts off, they often go back to Hegel, because the Hegelian notion of desire is actually right there, and it brings in the notion of negativity, the notion of, is desire a longing, what does it consist of, what is the difference between desire and pleasure? All these questions are extremely central. Let me briefly say that, for example, Judith Butler, she did her dissertation on the French reception of Hegel in French psychoanalysis. So this idea of recognition and desire, that has been there since the very beginning, and I think this is where we need to go back to. This is extremely central. And I think this is, when it comes to the debate with the liberalists or the liberal feminists, what I think it's worth stressing here is that sex will never be safe. The only thing that there is safer sex. We can make it safer, and we shall make it safer, in terms of reproductive safety and the question of STIs, of sexual transmittable diseases. So we have to do a lot to make it culturally safer. But sex will always be a risky thing. It will always be something that is on the edge of the existence. And I think in liberal discussions, it's often the attempt is to make it super safe. Yeah? As if when we do all the pre-scene negotiations, we have been said everything, then there won't be any risk. Yeah? And I think this is an illusion that a critical theory shall stress. Yeah? That because of the negativity and the ambivalence of the erotic, the attempt shall be to make it safer and more lustful and more providing and satisfactory and more, but it will always be a challenge. It will always be something that requires an engagement and an ability to risk. Yeah? And I think I think that's a very important thing for me. My last slide, and then I'll be ending, my last point is about the conditions of research. I've been now more or less out in these topics since a couple of years, and I often witness some sort of a marginalization, as if this would not be a real philosophical problem, because it's not metaphysical, it's just empirical or something. It's not worth to be put in the merit, or not to be rewarded with the merits of a real research topic. And many scholars testify and witness something like that too. So I think there was a structural sex negative dimension in research. We have no money. It's absolute. No one has money when it comes to these questions. I mean, in Germany, we've got about 4 professorships dedicated to the question of sex. That's to say, sexology. 4. We've got, I did a research, I think we have got almost 1,000 professorships for marketing. So there is a huge gap between the money that is dedicated to these questions and the money that there is in the system. But the system distributes the money to their topics that are not related to sex, and I think this is a big problem, because I mean, we have so much sexual violence in this life world. We have so many open questions on so many levels. There is so little knowledge. Yeah, there is so little knowledge that I find it kind of embarrassing, actually, I must say, for my own profession, that there is this huge gap between the actual need to produce knowledge and what we've got in terms of resources. So yeah, I think this is my main plea, that I like to open up the discussion and invite you to make your questions and comments and continue the conversation among these topics. Thank you very much for your attention. Sí, gracias.
Muchas gracias, Toby, por tu excelente presentación. Estoy seguro que va a haber muchas preguntas y mucho feedback para que puedas continuar con tu investigación. Les agradeceré entonces que a quienes quieran participar haciéndole preguntas o elaborando algún aporte o contribución a la presentación de Tobias Wieland, levanten la mano para poder darles la palabra. Julio.
Voy a superar la represión y voy a formular algunas preguntas. Gracias, Tobias, por tu interesante ponencia, y gracias también por tocar un tema que no necesariamente es abordado en la academia, ¿no? Me parece muy importante. Cuando comenzaste a desarrollar tu trabajo, veía que, digamos, dabas mayor tiempo en el desarrollo de las ideas a la sexualidad y no al erotismo, que son dos cosas diferentes, ¿no es cierto? Y claro, en este desarrollo de tus ideas sobre los problemas de cómo nuestras sociedades viven la sexualidad y cómo eso se ve reflejado, por ejemplo, en la industria de la pornografía, con la censura a diversas prácticas, quedó como que en el aire el tema del erotismo, ¿no? Y hacia el final de la ponencia señala que es justamente una suerte de replanteo de la sexualidad a partir de una visión estética de lo que tendría que ser la vida en general, ¿no? Las relaciones humanas y las relaciones también en el plano íntimo, ¿no? Me gustaría que no solamente que desarrolles un poquito más ese asunto, sino me pareció a mí que esa salida estética no estaría ayudando en el cambio social o político que, por ejemplo, Marcuse exigiría, ¿no? Entonces, ¿cómo se da ese paso de la crítica o de, digamos, la solución estética al problema de la sexualidad y su relación con el cambio social o la transformación?
Yeah, thank you. That's a very good question, because it's true. I mean, the difference between sexuality and eroticism is, I think, is a normative difference. Yeah, that's to say, the erotic is something that takes place beyond what Freud calls the reality principle. So we don't do it for the sake of reproduction or for this. We don't have a mediate aim for which we do it. So erotic is kind of done for its own sake. I mean, this is the reason why. I take it to be the reason that why Marcuse comes back to Schiller when he starts to spell out the erotic dimension of the sexual play. That's to say, there is an idea of doing it for its own sake. Yeah. We might also spell this out along Kantian lines and say it's an interesseloses Wohlgefallen. So we do it. It's a disinterest, so to speak. Yeah. So it's not about reproduction. It's not about an aim of reaching at something. It's done for its own sake. And I think in that sense, it's a normative idea, because we shall do it, so to speak. That's a normativity of it. Yeah. We shall emancipate from direct means of reproduction and engage in the erotic as a field that allows us to develop our own capacities to bodily communication. So I think this is the normative idea that I find in Marcuse. Yeah? And Marcuse goes on and says it's about generating lasting erotic encounters. Okay, that's definitely good, but we shall not limit it to this. We can also say that every erotic encounter, even the spontaneous one, even the short, brief erotic encounter in an orgy or something, which is very brief, could do justice to the idea of being done for its own sake. Yeah, and I think this is something I really find interesting. I think it's worth to think of this, to think of the erotic as something that is done for its own sake. And I think what I did not mention here, but what I do in my further texts on this is I work then with Bataille. Georges Bataille has a very beautiful idea of, which is not idealistic, so to speak. He doesn't go back to Schiller and Kant. It's a different form of economy. So that's to say, the energy that we put into the erotic play is a form of consumption. So we consume energy, but not for the sake of accumulating more and more profit and more benefit. And, in that sense, it's not capitalist. It's not done for the sake of accumulation. It's done for the sake of itself. So that's why Bataille brings the idea of the erotic close to the religious experience, the ecstatic experience. Yeah, and I think this is extremely important when it comes to understand the politicality of the erotic. That if we understand sex along these lines as an erotic practice done for its own sake, then we end up with a picture that allows us to integrate the spiritual dimension of sex. Yeah, that's to say, there is a level of spirituality, not only in terms of what we find in Tantra, these practices in which you kind of put very closely the sexual or the erotic experience and the aesthetic, the religious experience. It's also in the sense of the hesitation to engage in the logics of the market in terms of accumulating more and more and more. Yeah? To stop this and stay with the moment, stay with the present. In that sense, the spiritual has a critical aspect, and I think this is very important when it comes to understand the eroticism as you said yourself, right? As a salida aesthetica out of this mass of capitalist logic of production. And this is this is the overarching idea. Thank you for the question.
Sí, Luis.
Bueno, esta última parte en la que se empezó a hablar de esta idea del feminismo liberal, que no es posible un sexo seguro sino un safer sex, me da curiosidad por qué caminos podría tomar, porque, por ejemplo, yo estoy interesada en el lado conceptual, digamos, entre, por ejemplo, una diferenciación entre lo que es una violación y un sexo no consentido. Si podemos decir que se trata de lo mismo, porque muchas veces pasa que mujeres pueden experimentar situaciones medio difusas o poco claras que no permiten a esa misma persona diferenciar si lo que ha sucedido, lo que ha vivido es violación o no. Digamos, me gusta esta exploración conceptual y digamos si es que podría ser ese un camino por donde podría ir la teoría crítica.
Yes, well, that's a great question. Thank you. That's absolutely, I mean, when it comes to the burden of, I mean, what shall a critical theory of the ethical framework of sex be able to do? What is the aim? And I think the aim should not be to tell us about the extremes. It's not about the consensual sex within the marriage versus rape, and then suggesting that would be everything that there is. It's about the gray zones. It's about that big field in between, the slippery cases, the cases in which it's not clear if consent has been given. And this is, I think, the criteria of assessment of a good critical theory of the ethics of sex, if they're able to spell out these slippery cases. And so I'm absolutely sympathetic to that question, because I think it points at a very important aspect of such a thing as a critical theory of the erotic, because and this is, I mean, there's this beautiful text, a cat story in New Yorkers a couple of years ago, in which the story is often the case, right? We often, consent is something that is not explicitly given, yeah? And what does that mean? Is the absence of not giving consent confirmation? Yeah? that is one big question. The other big question is about the timely extension of consent. Sometimes you say yes, yeah, up to a certain extent, explicitly or implicitly to something, which feels afterwards, in respect, something you shouldn't have done, for example. Yeah? And this is a big, I mean, this is where you see why the gray zones are so interesting, and not the extreme cases, not the clear cases within the household or the way, but the slippery cases. And what I find here interesting is to actually do some, let's say, field work, yeah, and have a look on actual conceptions of consent. And we do find them in BDSM. I mean, in BDSM, it started with a conception that is called safe, sane, and consensual. Yeah, SSC. That is the oldest, the most traditional conceptualization in BDSM. It has a big problem because it is rather defensive. It says within an objective framework of what is morally permissible, adults can consent. So consent here is taken to be a necessary condition. Yeah, within morally sane activities, what we consent to, yeah, that's permissible sex. And so the answer, or the rejection of that within the scene was to come up with the notion of consent that puts more emphasis on the agent, that's risk-aware consensual kink, that's RAC. And in BDSM, we often use these acronyms, that's another thing, but you know, SSC and RAC. So the point here is that we have to stress the agent's capacity to navigate and follow their own compass of desire. Yeah? And that's to say, we need more of communication, we need more often, we need a more explicit culture of talking about what we want. So it's an ethic that puts emphasis on the tops, a capacity and task to make explicit what they want the scene to be like. Yeah? So it's the idea that the top needs to be the one who addresses questions of safety, question of potential traumata, injuries on the bottom side. So it puts lots of emphasis. It's a protocol, actually, that helps you to ask the right questions before the scene. And I think this is the reason why I said that we can learn from BDSM. Because when Manon Garcia is right saying that sex might be thought of as a conversation, what might be a good protocol for these conversations to happen? And I think in BDSM there's lots of expertise to shed lights in the gray zones, yeah, and be aware of the fact that a simple yes or no does not do the job. Yeah, we don't need. It's not sufficient to say yes, just yes. You need to say to what do you want to say yes and to what not. Yeah, because often you like certain things, but you hate tickling. Yeah, you can do everything, but don't tickle me. Yeah, and you need to make that explicit. And I like that idea of. That not to be, let's say, on the bottom's burden, on the bottom side, but on the top side. And I think this helps with the gray zones. But acknowledging the fact that sex will always be, in that sense, 50 Shades of Grey. I mean, yeah. But thank you. No.
Sí.
Sí, hola, Tobias. Mi pregunta es mucho más puntual. Hay un punto que tocaste en la ponencia que me parece importante, pero no les llega a comprender del todo, que era el problem of the gatekeeper. No sé si puedes, could you go deeper into it?
Yeah, thank you. I mean, it was a short argument. Maybe it helps to broaden it a bit. I think generally, when it comes to morally problematic practices such as porn, prostitution, and perversion, the idea to prohibit and censor and ban, that idea will never work. So I think this is the general line of thinking. Yeah? Instead of trying to get rid of the problem, we need to stay with the problem. We need to stay with the trouble, to use this term by Hegel. And so this idea to stay with the trouble is that to acknowledge that it's true that the anti-porn liberal movement, so to speak, is right in saying that mainstream pornography reproduces a script, a standard, a code that is often too close to violence to be just accepted, so to speak. There is a problem. Yeah? They're right at pointing at that problem, but the answer to that problem will not be prohibition. And I think the most convincing argument, to my understanding, is that of what I call the problem of the gatekeeper, or what is called actually the problem of the gatekeeper. Because if we are to prohibit, who is then to enforce the prohibition? That is the question of who is the actual agent of the censorship. And the problem of the gatekeeper is just to show that when it comes to decide over a specific cultural artifact, yeah, is that porn or just a very aesthetic, kind of edgy display of a sexual act? Yeah? Where does it start? Where does the erotic film and the porn start? When it comes to this, actually, in the end of the day, it's a definitional question. When it comes to this definitional question, the statal agency will not be the one who is free and liberated enough to just objectively decide over that question. They will always bring in their own prejudices. And that's why I came up with this list of what is banned in Brittany nowadays, because if you have a deeper look on it, what you see there is actually male prejudice to be reproduced in this list. It's not a neutral list. It's not that there is a common ground, so to speak, of what is morally problematic. It's a list that reproduces a certain heteronormative standard of what good sex, so to speak, looks like. Good sex does not entail aggressive ripping. Yeah? But again, who is to decide what is aggressive ripping? Yeah? And that's to say, if you have such a list, that might be a list that informs censorship. What you see then there is actually it opens up all the problems of arbitrariness. And then we are no step further. And we still have the problematic act, we still have mainstream pornography that actually objectifies women and has a very weird picture of male performance at the same time. It's very sad what is put at display in mainstream porn. We still have that, but we have it banned. Let's say it becomes even less open and less of a topic that can go controversial over, because it will be banned, it will be taken off the visible market. So banning and prohibition is not the solution. And I think a sex-positive answer is not to say no to porn, it's to say yes to a new form of porn. Yeah? Let's say a porn that is breaking with that what is called the male gaze, coming up with more creative forms of communication, more amorphic forms of sexual encounters in which the dominant part is not the male part, but we switch. I mean, switchiness is a big topic. So it's all these new forms of putting the erotic at display. That is, I think, the way to go instead of banning it. That's the overarching idea. And the problem of the gatekeeper is just the reason why I think prohibition doesn't do the job.
Okay.
Sí, bueno, un comentario y una pregunta, claro. Yo, por mi trabajo de investigación de tesis, estoy familiarizado con el debate que hubo sobre todo con McKinnon, y un comentario. Primero es que a mí me parece que McKinnon hace un salto en decir la pornografía objetiviza a las mujeres, entonces, porque él la toma como un acto de habla que tiene ciertos rasgos, entonces dice, bueno, entonces hay que prohibirlo, pero en realidad lo que ella dice que es moralmente malo es la objetivación de las mujeres.
Yeah.
Entonces, si hay pornografía que no objetiviza a las mujeres, porque habría que prohibirla todo, además del problema del gatekeeper, ¿no? Y mi pregunta, bueno, no sé si tendrás algún comentario sobre esto, mi pregunta es si es que, o bueno, de qué manera, si es que alguna, la investigación de la sexualidad y como un fenómeno estético que está en el límite de la vulnerabilidad, de la existencia, puede tener o necesita tener, o cuáles serían, si es que las tiene, las consecuencias para la vida social en términos más amplios. O sea, claro, esto va a afectar cómo nosotros experimentamos nuestra corporalidad y cómo experimentamos nuestra identidad, en términos más o menos generales. ¿Cómo eso, o si es que tiene algunas consecuencias para los marcos sociales, o comunales, institucionales en los que vivimos, políticos en los que vivimos, ¿no? Porque, claro, ha dicho varias veces que justamente el marco social en el que el deseo se forma es político, pues está embarcado en relaciones de poder. ¿Cuáles serían las consecuencias?
Sí. Gracias. Es muy buena la pregunta, gracias. I mean, I think Wilhelm Reich, one of the very first theorists of such a thing as a critical theory of sex, a very controversial figure. His answer might be that the political emancipation will follow out of the sexual emancipation. Yeah? And I think this is a bit too far out, and this is too much. So in that sense, I take your question as exactly pointing at that question, of what comes first, so to speak. And I would not consider myself a Reichian thinker. So I do think that we need to keep separated questions regarding the economic, the political, and the, let's say, the cultural sphere. Yeah. So in that sense, the sexual emancipation is not sufficient for political emancipation. Yeah. But nevertheless, I don't think it's only a sector and only just one margin, so to speak. And I do think that there's a general interest, because what we can definitely learn from that is, to me, it's twofold. It's one thing is that goes back to the question of the erotic. I think this nexus of sex and the spiritual dimension brings about a higher awareness of what we might what we might call in philosophical terms as holistic thinking. That's to say, the relationality, this idea of me being in reciprocity only what I am, this insight that there is something higher than us to which we contribute by taking care of it, by staying in the present, by being in this moment, by cultivating our communicative skills. Yeah? This is something we need to learn, because in this, let's say, individualistic times we live in, we just look at ourselves and we take our freedom as a dominion, as something that is only mine, and then we end up with this picture of my freedom ending where yours begins. And I think this is a whole picture of freedom. Freedom is, I mean, the Hegelians call this social freedom, right? Freedom is something that is only accessible when it's something that we all engage in, that we all have. So we share freedom, and we need to communicate in order to be free. And this, let's say, spiritual dimension of the erotic, that can inform all other levels. Yeah, that's one aspect. So that's very important for me. And the other thing that I like to stress is, if we are to cultivate our sexual capacities or erotic communications, I think we will also question power relations, and we will be more sensitive to power relations in general, because we have a lot of power relations going on even beyond the bedroom. I mean, there is this quote by Oscar Wilde, right? He says, right, everything in this world is about sex, except sex. Sex is about power. So if we acknowledge this, and this is also a contribution to the question of why sex will never be safe, but only safer, if we acknowledge the very fact that we have to deal with dynamics of dominance, of guidance, of leading, of dominating, so to speak, of bottoming and topping, if that is something we cultivate in sex, then we can come up with a higher sensitivity to other forms of power that I mentioned, which are not in the bedroom. Yeah, and I think that's also very important. That's to say, to give you a very concrete example of what I mean, and this is not directly coming from sexual practices, but from dance. There is a technique of dance which is called contact improvisation. Yeah, let's just say it's a group dance which does not have a standard script, but it's a movement of the group. So everyone gives impulses, is topping in that sense, gives an idea, but also is receptive, takes up ideas. And this is a cultivation of dance that is very amorphic, it's bodily communication. And one of the things that I find very instructive here is that if I want to dance with you, I can grab you, right? I can take you, and drive you a certain way. That's a very aggressive act. Yeah? I can do the same. I can give you the same impulse without grabbing my fingertips, but lifting my fingertips. Yeah, I do the same thing. Yeah? But this is more like an offer. That is more like, here I am. I would like to go on with you that way. But if you don't, okay, fine with me. Yeah? So in this sense, it's communicative skills that are clear. I give an impulse, but also they don't demand, they don't order, they offer impulse. Yeah? This is something we can cultivate, and this is something we can transfer to many other regions of social reproduction. And when it comes to the academy, we all know that we've got to deal with many power relations, and this sensitivity to power relations, and acknowledge that there are power relations, yeah, but also make them more fluid, make them more inclusive up to a certain extent. This is something we can learn from this, such a thing as a critical theory of the erotic.
Me parece sumamente interesante el tema. La pregunta que tenía era sobre la respuesta a esto. Comentaste que San Inivason, por ejemplo, evitaba moralizar el deseo, ¿no? Y sí, dijiste que una teoría crítica también debería hacer eso. Me parece que una respuesta es a por qué hacer eso es lo que dijiste, el problema del gatekeeper. Pero me parece que otro giro que podría hacer alguien que cree que sí se debe moralizar esto, como que hay prácticas que son malas, sería debemos cambiar, ¿no? Como un tema de cambiar tu propia conciencia y cambiar tus prácticas individuales, y es la acción política que se deriva de eso, es concientizar a los demás, ¿no? Porque eso está mal, entonces no deberían hacerlo, y no debería haber como que alguien que lo enforce it. Y no sé si hay otro caso aparte, ¿no? Pero bueno, se me ocurre, ¿cómo podemos responder a esto?
Sí. No, gracias. Yeah, I mean, I said that there is no such a thing as normality. Yeah, in that sense, one might say, okay, there are, as you said, no, prácticas que son malas. And I think there is one aspect, or the one practice, let's not call it practice, one problem that you are kind of pointing at, because if I say that we shall not moralistically say what is good and bad, but acknowledge the diversity of what there is, what do we do then with pedophilia, for example? Yeah, that's an obvious case. Yeah, how do we draw that line? Yeah, and I mean, you're nodding, so I take your question to be kind of pointing in that direction. Zoophilia might be another topic, but it's less urgent, I think. And the question here is, if the shift from what is in BDSM called SSC to risk-aware consensual kink, that shift is to say, we gave up the ideal of sanity. Let's say there is no objective framework within which we can decide what is good and bad. Yeah, because everything is normal. If that shift from the sanity, let's say whatever defined way of healthy sex, if that idea is given up and replaced by the notion of risk-aware consensual kink, let's say we put all the emphasis on the agent's capacity to engage and decide what they want to engage in. So that's to say, logically speaking, according to SSC, consent is a necessary condition. Within the objectively given framework of what is healthy, we can consent to. So no, that's you find the consent on the necessary side. According to RAG, it moves and becomes a sufficient condition. Yeah. So if consent, then morally permissible. But consent given by risk-aware consensual kinksters, by people who know what they do, who are capable of deciding what they do, and capable of following their own compass of desire, and they know they have an awareness of what they do. And I think this is enough also to spell out I mean, I don't want to declare a picture in which pedophilia is morally permissible, but why is pedophilia morally not permissible? Because kids are not aware of what they do. Yeah? There is no awareness of them to what that is. I mean, they have no idea of the loadedness of their body, so they cannot consent. Kids are not they're not capable of consenting. Yeah? So that is the question. Then we can. It's more about informing kids. It's more about letting them know that they say no, and that they have to say no, that they have a right to say something. This is, I think, what sexual education should put them in. Should they allow them to be capable of, allow them to learn. that there is something like a necessity to instruct them to say no and develop their own compass of desire. That takes lots of time, but there is definitely no need, so to speak, to go ahead from the no to normality, so to speak, to having to include everything. Because we can, I do think that the capacity to consent is a sufficient explainer, so to speak, to draw the line between these sorts of activities that are not morally permissible. And same with, I hope this,
Tengo una pregunta. Cuando leí el título de tu presentación y luego después de que te he escuchado hoy, tú haces referencia a una teoría crítica del erotismo, eroticismo, no sé si es una palabra en castellano, y lo que necesariamente me viene a la mente es una crítica inmanente del eroticismo y una crítica inmanente del sexo. Si entendemos crítica inmanente, o si entendemos por crítica inmanente una suerte de metodología más o menos estandarizada en autores contemporáneos recientes, podríamos entender también al sexo como una, digamos, forma de vida. Las relaciones sexuales, las relaciones eróticas son prácticas sociales más o menos institucionalizadas, regidas por normas y en relación a las cuales podemos distinguir buenas y malas prácticas. Por eso podemos criticarlas, ¿no? Escuchándote, por momentos veía los nexos con esta crítica inmanente del sexo, pero por momentos no. Aunque sospecho que de alguna manera está vinculado tu proyecto con este marco más grande actual de la teoría crítica. Lo que me gustaría saber es si es verdad lo que sospecho y cómo estaría vinculado, o si he entendido mal y eventualmente si consideras que podría vincularse.
That's a great question. Actually, it's a great question. I never used that framework of immanent critique to question myself whether or not what I'm doing actually counts as immanent critique. It's a great question because, I mean, methodologically speaking, yes. I mean, I'm invested into critical theory. That's my method. Yeah, but it's a great question. Really helpful. I mean, what I do find, I think, what is speaking in favor of understanding this as as some sort of immanent critique is that I do go and have a look on actual sexual practices. So the relevance of BDSM, the standards of BDSM, this is actually the self-articulation of the institutionalized sexual practices. So this is an articulation of the norms and the reflexivity inscribed into normativity. There's a standard of, and I think the standard is what we can use to criticize bad and good sex, so to speak. So there is this is what I definitely share, what I intuitively would like to stress, because it's, as you said, right, critical theory or immanent critique is invested to the premise that there are standards within the practice and that there's a self-articulation of the standards within the practice, and this is what allows us to criticize practice. Yeah? And I think this is exactly what I do with this, I would call this a praxeological account, that I have a look on the actual standards and also like to contribute to that field by moving on and going beyond SSC and RAG and move on and find new standards, develop new standards. So in that sense, I think it's an example of immanent critique. So that would be my part to say yes to the question. There's also something in me that is a bit of a hesitant, but I think that goes back to the question of the relation of critical theory and psychoanalysis. Yeah, and that's now more or less this contribution to the question: what then else do we understand by immanent critique? I mean, there's a version of Honneth and Habermas. I mean, let's stay with Honneth. He has a very rationalistic understanding of psychoanalysis. Yeah, this kind of, I rationally reconstruct my traumata when I'm on the couch. Yeah? And I'm not sure if that is what I want. Yeah? I think the picture that I like to stay with is that there is a certain negativity that is part of human desire. So there is this double play of attraction, but also of destruction. So for example, when it comes to big battlefield, so to speak, is actually the relation between the primary caregiver, aka the mother often, and the baby or the kid. Yeah, it's often, especially in Honneth, it's kind of idealized picture of that of the maternal expressivity to be there just for the sake of the offspring and the flourishing of the baby. So there is no negativity in his picture of the maternal love. Yeah, it's pathologized. If there is negativity, some sort of moments of even of hatred, of destructive feelings, all that, it's pathologized. This picture by Honneth, and I think this is what I find very problematic. So I think we need to do justice to the double-edged character of love, of desire, and not to, let's say, pink-wash desire and say desire is just this, I want you to strive and nourish, that I want you to suffer and that I want you to be in pain is part of desire. It's not me be a pathological case. And I think this is what I would, that's my version, or maybe not my version. I mean, it's not, I don't want to declare it as my own, but I think this is where I think I would have to move on from this, let's say, Habermasian, Honnethian picture of immanent critique, which is still in the back of it, which still holds on a non-negativistic understanding of this idea of being there for the other.
Lo que me preocupa en tu proyecto es que por momentos percibo una oposición un poco fuerte entre la dimensión estética y una dimensión normativa de la crítica, donde no se puede obviar lo normativo porque de otra manera no habría un criterio para evaluar si son buenas o malas prácticas. Y por otro lado es un comentario, en todo caso, no Habermas, no Honneth, no Hegel, leicht, pero sí Rosa y el concepto de resonancia como una forma de abordar la experiencia erótica, quizás. Iría más de acuerdo con tu proyecto.
Sí. Well, that's a very good remark. I mean, that's helpful. I mean, it's true that the tension between the aesthetic and the normative, I mean, the ethical and the aesthetical dimension, that's something I don't have a final answer to that, and I don't think I will have to, but it's a very good remark to be aware of this tension, right? That might be taken as two different projects. One project is to come up with the ethics of sex, and the other one is about the aesthetic dimensions. But I think when I follow Marcuse, I think it's a what I see here as the binding force or the binding common ground here is this idea of freedom. The aesthetic cannot be thought of without the reference to freedom, neither normative questions. But it's true that the idea of freedom as being done for its own sake, I mean, as we discussed earlier with regards to the aesthetic question, maybe I should, I need to stay with the trouble and say that this is what binds them together in my point, but to my understanding. But it's a fair critique. And the other one, about Rosa. I mean, he was here. I understand. I mean, it's good to hear this resonantia, because I like resonantia way more than acceleration. But slowing down is a good thing in sex. So it could also come from that point. But I mean, it's true. Why not? I mean, this idea of resonance in this conversation that we might then call sex, it's definitely it's helpful, because I think this idea of understanding the dialectics of dominance and submission. I mean, I have this big background in Hegelianism, like I said in the very outset. No, that's why I often go back to this phenomenology of spirit and this reference to the dialectics of dominance and submission. It's helpful when it comes to the understanding of power relations, because it also provides for an emancipative understanding. Because the bottom part in Hegel's picture becomes the actual leading role. It's not a picture in which he defends the dominant side as the truth of Sorry, I lost the word. Selbstbewusstsein is
Self-consciousness.
Thank you. That's the word. But the bottom is actually the one who takes the lead over in the following of the story. And I like that picture because it helps me to flesh out the idea of I don't want a picture in which, and this is against the liberal feminist to a certain extent. I don't want a picture of mere equality. I don't think it's about sameness. There will always be certain, not hierarchy, but a play of someone who's giving an impulse and someone who's following an impulse. Yeah? And this idea of understanding power relations as something that we can play with, that we can put in fluidity in terms of something that's just naturally given. I think this is what I like to stress as an idea of emancipation. And the idea of resonantia might be very helpful when it comes to spelling out this idea. Instead of I just take what I want, I listen to that object that I want. I listen to what that object wants. So there is a resonance. That's to say that the idea of guidance and the idea of dominating is actually also an act of serving. It's an act of listening. And that the idea of resonantia is something that is double-edged or dialectical in its very core, because to resonate means to sound and to listen, right? It's always both. And I think this is very helpful when it comes to making power relations in sex more fluid, more switchy, more open to putting things upside down and invert actually standard scripts. And I think the idea of becoming a better listener and becoming someone who's more sensitive to the individual law of that body I'm playing with and feeling that body is actually, it's not passive, it's not me just being inert, but it's also not active in the sense of I just project my will upon that object and do with it whatever I want. It's kind of it's an active passive kind of thing. Yeah, and I think this is quite vividly explicit, quite vividly described in Rosa, even though he does not really deal with the erotic, to my understanding. You know, it's more a general sociology of.
Sí, pero pienso, por ejemplo, en el símil con la conversación, una conversación que fluye, una conversación ideal, ¿no? A Habermas, pero el problema con Habermas para Rosa es que la conversación, el diálogo siempre tiene un fin, que es un acuerdo racional. Por lo tanto, lo que pasa en la conversación está condicionado por el acuerdo que quieres alcanzar.
Sí.
Y Rosa critica esa forma de comunicación oponiendo, porque se encuentra dentro del modelo de la aceleración y opone una relación de tipo resonante. Y me parece que eso va muy en la línea de tu crítica a una forma limitada, instrumental, objetivante, cosificadora de entender el sexo, ¿no? Yo creo que Rosa podría ser un buen marco, eventualmente, para un marco adicional, ¿no? A lo que ya estás haciendo. Claro.
Sí. Eso me parece muy helpful to combine that idea. That's true. Yeah. I mean, la conversación sin fin is exactly, it's a good picture. I mean, I used this idea of Marcuse and Schiller and Bataille, but I think it's a perfect line of thinking to combine this with Rosa. That's helpful. It's I mean, yeah, exactly. I mean, I stay with that. It's like philosophy. It's a combination without a telos, right? Yeah. Conversación sin fin. It's done for its own sake.
Bien, tenemos tiempo para una última pregunta breve, si la hubiera. Si no, podemos quedarnos aquí. Sí, Gino.
Ya, regresando sobre el tema de cerrado todavía, que es el argumento del gatekeeper, de quien sostiene la censura, ¿verdad? No sé si me termina de convencer, porque siento que podría ser aplicable también para la otra posición, ¿no? Finalmente el asunto de quién se encarga de censurar o quién se encarga de, por ejemplo, producir
otro tipo de porno, que sea feminista, que tenga otro tipo de mirada. Sinceramente, me parece, va en ambas direcciones, la pregunta termina siendo la misma. Y puede ser más bien un poco simplificador de lo que sería la posición radical feminista, ¿no? Porque, por supuesto, el argumento radical feminista no solamente es hay que prohibir el porno, hay que prohibirlo y hacer estas otras cosas que van a evitar que este tipo de situaciones a nivel sexual se vayan a seguir reproduciendo, ¿no? Entonces, fijarnos en quiénes específicamente van a encargarse de reforzar esta prohibición, creo que ignora un poco el punto de fondo, ¿no? Sería justamente, bueno, evitar que quienes se encarguen de reforzar la prohibición sean personas que van a participar del male gaze, ¿no? De esta perspectiva más patriarcal, ¿no? Entonces, en ese sentido, no veo cómo termina de funcionar el argumento, realmente. Entonces, lo que es aplicable para ambos lados, no sé si en todo caso sea posible más bien acudir a un argumento distinto, tal vez un poco más fuerte para ese aspecto, porque de todos modos sí estoy de acuerdo con que la prohibición no es necesariamente la solución más práctica, ¿no? Solamente que este argumento me parece un poco de...
It's, how could I say, I mean, it's not my own argument, so to speak, right? I just reconstruct a certain debate for the sake of fleshing out what is called sex-positive feminism. So it's not my own, I'm not that much invested in porn, yeah? And it's not my, yeah? But I mean, I'm very open for any ideas to strengthen the line of argumentation. I mean, as you said, right, it could be seen as two different things. We could debate over the whether or not of prohibiting porn and still insist of a, let's say, non-standard, non-heteronormative porn industry to emerge. Yeah? I mean, this is not, logically, it's kind of independent. And I think, maybe you just put it that way. That is what I share with liberalism. That the idea of prohibiting, when it comes to problematic practices in general, it's often a bad idea. Yeah, does not really do the job. I mean, the Hegelian in me would think of an abstract negation. Just pretend that the problem doesn't exist anymore, but it's kind of driven away and marginalized and re-emerges in the underground, and that it's even worse with working conditions and all that. So I think that idea of a gatekeeper to be unapt, to be incapable of doing their job, I think it's the strongest argument that I see so far, but I'm very happy for alternative.
Pero digo, un argumento que tal vez tenga más que ver con el problema de la represión, ¿no? O sea, finalmente, si tú le prohíbes algo a alguien, genera deseos, ¿no? El deseo de la transgresión de esa prohibición. Eso me parece en todo caso más fuerte que el otro argumento.
Ya veo. Okay. So that we actually strengthen what we want to diminish by prohibiting it, because we give the human being another possibility to just transgress what's good. Okay, I see. Okay. That's true. I mean, the desire of to transgress boundaries, that's why sex is problematic. Yeah. It will always be. Yeah. But thank you. Okay. Thank you. I will put this into the next version of that talk.
Bien, muchas gracias por su participación. Gracias hoy otra vez por su conferencia.